While we're unable to welcome you to Vancouver, we are thrilled that you will be joining us from all around the world for what will be a wonderful 4 days of conference presentations from over 30 scholars and practitioners who are speaking to the continent's most recent development agenda.
What do I do?
Kindly ask that if you're not speaking, if you can mute yourself. I'm especially delighted to welcome Judge Nkemdilim Izuako as our keynote speaker to kickstart our conference. Before we begin today's keynote, it is the practice to begin all events at the University of British Columbia with a land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge that UBC Vancouver's Point Grey campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I myself am joining you from the traditional territories of the Coast Salish, Tsawwassen, Kwantlen, and Musqueam peoples in Richmond, BC. I make this statement to acknowledge my own responsibilities as a law professor to teach how the law sustains historically embedded and ongoing forms of colonization and racism in Canada. I would also like to recognize that you are joining us today from many places, near and far, and to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. On behalf of the conference organizing team, I would like to thank our sponsors and partners, the Peter A. Allard School of Law, the Liu Institute Network for Africa, the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia, and the Institute for African Women in Law. Also, the conference organizing team would like to thank two incredible student research assistants, Dinah Holliday and Binta Cisse, whose time and energy made this conference possible. Over a year ago, the conference organizing team began thinking of ways we could highlight African perspectives on the changing landscape and roles for law and development across the continent. Development has dominated the political economic agendas of African states, both individually and collectively, since independence swept across the continent over 60 years ago. Since the Year of Africa in 1960, however, African states have struggled to promote an independent and domestically sourced vision of development. At the same time, they have attempted to forge continental development programs, including the most recent Agenda 2063. Following more than 60 years of these efforts, several African states continue to face daunting domestic and regional development challenges. Today, Africa's legal regimes are at a critical juncture as states seek to respond to mounting development challenges spurred by population growth, China's Belt and Road Initiative, attempts to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, and more. Legal responses have consistently been a focal point for development, and yet have failed to promote stable and meaningful development across Africa. I'm honored to introduce our keynote speaker for the conference, Judge Nkemdilim Izuako, who will speak to many of these tensions today. Judge Izuako was most recently one of the pioneer judges of the United Nations Dispute Tribunal in Nairobi. She served in this role from July 2009 until her retirement in July 2019. Judge Izuako obtained her LLB degree in 1976 and her LLM in 1981 from the then University of Ife, now renamed Obafemi Awolowo University in Nigeria, and was admitted to practice law in Nigeria in 1977. She became a fellow of the Center for the Study of Human Rights at the London School of Economics in 2003. Judge Izuako practiced law at a private firm in Nigeria before becoming a magistrate in 1982. She then worked in judicial administration and briefly with USAID Nigeria before becoming a judge of the High Court in 1998. From 2004 to 2006, Judge Izuako was appointed by the Commonwealth Secretariat as a judge of the High Court for the Gambia. In that time, she also sat on the Gambian Court of Appeals. After she completed her appointment in the Gambia, Judge Izuako was a consultant for the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime in Nigeria, while also training judges in judicial ethics. According to her colleagues, she has a remarkable record of risking her life to stand up for justice and anti-corruption in Nigeria, the Gambia, and even the United Nations. I would like to welcome Judge Izuako and thank her for taking the time to share her thoughts on the conference theme of reimagining Agenda 2063 and law and development in Africa more broadly. Following her remarks, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. I will take questions via the chat and by using the raised hand function in Zoom. If you wish to remain anonymous, you can send me questions directly in the chat. And just so everyone is aware, in addition to this keynote address that's being recorded, we'll also be recording the closing remarks on Thursday from Professor Penelope Andrews. And these will be available online for those who could not attend. If you are not going to be speaking, I remind you to please keep your microphones muted, and you may leave your video off or you can leave it on during today's discussion. Thanks, and now over to you, Judge Izuako.
Thank you, Sarah. And let me start by saying good evening from Nigeria to participants and organizers of this important conference. I thank the organizers too for so graciously asking me to give this keynote speech. And I've entitled my speech, Africa Must Get This Right. Yeah, I'll start with a personal story. Just over 3 weeks ago, precisely in the morning of Saturday, 29 May 2021, I was traveling in my car from my home in Anambra State, Nigeria, to Enugu, a city of about 1.5 hours away. Barely 15 minutes into the journey, we met a gridlock. We noticed that apart from a roadblock and a long queue of cars, tanker trucks and haulage trucks on the bad road, there were armed soldiers shouting insults at passengers and ordering them to come down from their cars and to walk in a single file past the roadblock, and with both hands raised. That was the order. I saw hundreds of people, some carrying crying babies and children, others old or disabled, working and raising their hands or trying to. The rains had come and the roads were wet, slippery, and muddy. A soldier was pointing his gun at the crowd of people walking on that muddy road, and it was like a scene from a horror movie. I came down from my car and joined the ordered work, while my driver slowly rolled the car past the soldiers' roadblock like other drivers. We all walked for a distance of about 1/4 of a kilometer and then waited to get back into our cars and resume the journey. Barely 10 minutes later, we met another roadblock and the same experience played out again. The journey to Enugu took us all of 4 hours on that day. That practice of treating ordinary citizens on the road like prisoners of war in some jungle still continues in the states of southeastern Nigeria as I speak to you today. The official justification for the bold display of such dehumanizing treatment is that some young people in this part of the country are agitating for secession and that there had been attacks on public infrastructure and security personnel. I had already received the invitation to give this keynote speech at the time, and since then have mostly stayed indoors. I keep reminding myself that this is 2021 and 8 years since Agenda 2063 came into being. Because I know that this kind of intimidation and disrespect of ordinary citizens does not happen only in Nigeria, I also continue to find myself asking no one in particular if this is the country of our aspirations, and by extension, whether this is the Africa we want. My country, Nigeria, with an estimated population of more than 211 million people, is Africa's most populous nation and makes up nearly 10% of the continent's entire population. As of 2020, Nigeria was the continent's biggest economy. Clearly, such display of poor governance, such assault on human rights cannot make for peace and security or bring sustainable development to Africa. The constant military presence on our roads in Nigeria, the absence of good governance, the constant attacks on democratic values, lack of respect for human rights, insecurity, and impunity, ethnic conflicts, corruption, and disdain for the rule of law, among other challenges, cannot continue both unchecked and free of any consequences if Africa aspires to achieve by 2063 the overall aspiration of becoming an influential global player and partner. Now I go to look at the next issue I want to discuss, which is the agenda itself, Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. Please, can we look at the slide? Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. Agenda 2063, yes, thank you. Agenda 2063 is a Pan-Africanist vision of development for our continent, which is usually described as a third world. It was first adopted in the form of a solemn declaration at the 21st Ordinary Assembly of the African Union in May 2013, during celebrations to mark the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, now rechristened African Union, AU. The vision stated that by 2063, there shall be an, and I quote, integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa, driven by its own citizens and representing a dynamic force in the international arena, and quotation closes. On 31st January 2015, Agenda 2063 was formally adopted in Addis Ababa by the 24th African Union Assembly of Heads of State and Government. The agenda itself is a list of 7 aspirations to be achieved by Africa within 50 years, and aptly titled Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. Considering the continent's checkered experience of slavery, colonialism, and apartheid, the agenda is rightfully ambitious and can mostly be achieved, in my view, long before 2063, if African leaders and peoples commit to it. Africa has a population of over 1.3 billion people, and the AU itself is made up of 55 member states. The AU, over time, has adopted several social, economic, and legal frameworks to promote sustainable development, continental trade, democracy and good governance, and to protect the human rights of its peoples, including women and children. For instance, the African Union, or OAU as it then was, adopted the African Charter on Human and People's Rights in 1981. It also adopted the Lagos Plan of Action for the Economic Development of Africa, which ran between 1980 and 2000. And in 2001, it adopted the New Partnership for Africa's Development, NEPAD, an economic development program for Africa. In 2003, it adopted the African Peer Review Mechanism for self-monitoring by AU member states. It also adopted the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Good Governance in 2007, among several others. Now I want to look at the goals of Agenda 2063. We'll look at the next slide, please. Thank you. 7 aspirations make up Agenda 2063. And these were developed over a period of 18 months through consultations with stakeholders in Africa and the diaspora, youth and women, government officials, civil society organizations, and media groups. The process of developing the agenda also builds on some already existing Africa African development initiatives, like the ones I mentioned earlier, Lagos Plan of Action, the new NEPAD, the APRM. It leveraged also on a review of Africa's development and of other global initiatives, such as the Millennium Development Goals, MDGs, adopted by the United Nations in 2000. And very quickly, I just want to list the 7 aspirations of the agenda. The first one is a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development. Second aspiration, an integrated continent, politically united and based on the ideals of Pan-Africanism and the vision of Africa's Renaissance. Third aspiration, an Africa of good governance, democracy, respect for human rights, justice, and the rule of law. 4, peaceful and secure Africa. And the 5th aspiration is an Africa with a strong cultural identity, common heritage, values, and ethics. 6th aspiration, an Africa whose development is people-driven, relying on the potential of African people, especially its women and youth, and caring for children. And the 7th aspiration, Africa as a strong, united, resilient, and influential global player and partner. Now, what makes Agenda 2063 different from previous AU instruments is that it is a holistic document that surpasses the goals of the MDGs of 2000 and the more recent Sustainable Development Goals 2030 of 2015. It constitutes both a guiding vision and a strategic framework designed to build an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa, driven and managed by its own citizens to become a global powerhouse that can take its place as a strong global partner. The agenda's 7 aspirations range from unity and political integration, as we can see, to shared values, to growth and economic development, to democracy and good governance, to peace, security, education, and protection of children. Agenda 2063 must be people-driven through harnessing the potentials of African peoples, especially its women and youth. Of course, that is part of the aspirations. The agenda itself is further structured into 5 10-year implementation plans to be implemented at national, regional, and continental levels. This means that Agenda 2063 requires domestication and incorporation into national programs and budgets by African governments with the involvement of civil society organizations and others. In February 2020, the agenda's first implementation report on the continental level was presented. Well, the report, of course, showed a country by country implementation or assessment of the implementation. And the report, to my mind, is not particularly encouraging, with an overall score of 33%. And with regard to Aspiration 3, the continental score is an even less encouraging 19%. The AU will do well to vigorously pursue the implementation of Agenda 2063 by its member states and to fully support its monitoring bodies with the tools needed to monitor country-to-country implementation. This is what I think. And then I'd like to look at Aspirations 3 and 4 of Agenda 2063 in this page. 2 out of the 7 aspirations of Agenda 2063 are especially critical. Aspiration 3 envisions an Africa of good governance, democracy, respect for human rights, justice, and the rule of law. While Aspiration 4 seeks a peaceful and secure continent, my submission is that these two aspirations are the core on which all the other 5 aspirations are anchored. Good governance is at the heart of any development agenda. The observance of democratic principles, respect for human rights, justice, and the rule of law. The observance of these mean that government is accountable and transparent and ensures that the economic and social needs of people are met. Arguments that some governments which do not embrace good government principles or good governance principles, such as North Korea and China, the argument that, governments like that can also have thriving economies, or that countries like that can have thriving economies, to my mind, are untenable, because Agenda 2063 looks to achieve a prosperous and peaceful continent where Africans not only have their human rights respected, but are also free from the lingering shadows of colonialism, apartheid, and oppression. On its part, Aspiration 4, which speaks to a peaceful and secure Africa, is also central to every other vision for Africa. Many parts of post-independent Africa had been subjected at different times to ethnic strife, unrest, terrorism, piracy, military coups d'etats, and the menace of warlords and their militias. The absence of peace and security in Africa meant that some of Africa's young had their childhood stolen and destroyed, through some of our children being conscripted into becoming child soldiers or being trafficked or enslaved. That situation gave rise to and continues to account for large numbers of refugees and internally displaced persons on this continent. There is no gainsaying that justice and the rule of law, which are both components of Aspiration 3, are crucial to the Africa we all want. In my judicial career, which spanned all of 37 years within and outside my country, Nigeria, I have sometimes found myself in very unpleasant situations. In September 2001, I gave a judicial decision while I was a judge of the High Court of Anambra State in my country, Nigeria. My decision offended the then governor of my state. Before that decision was given, the governor has sent an emissary to tell me that he had an interest in the matter. The emissary told me the decision he wanted me to give with a promise to reward me. Well, the orders I eventually made were not what he asked for, or were not what he asked or wanted. For nearly 2 years thereafter, a couple of attempts were made on my life for defying the governor. I was chased on the road to Abuja, on my way to Abuja, and stalked by hitmen hired to kill me. But fortunately, there were those close to the governor who gave me information about any planned attacks. And that helped me to stay a step ahead, while the then Inspector General of Police in Nigeria ensured I had armed policemen at home, and I had armed policemen guarding me everywhere I went. I can tell you it wasn't comfortable. At work, I was punitively transferred to a duty station where there was neither electricity nor water. And I sometimes had to place lighted candles on my table in the courtroom during proceedings in order to be able to take notes. I left Nigeria for the UK on a ticket paid for by Amnesty International in April 2003, not because I wanted, to, but only in order to stay alive. A year later, in 2004, I was hired by the Commonwealth to work as a judge in the Gambia. I worked in both the High Court and in the Court of Appeal. The Gambia at that time had former President Yahya Jammeh, who was removed in 2017 as head of state. Jammeh presided over a repressive government in which opposition politicians, journalists, and other citizens were often arrested, detained, sometimes tortured, sometimes prosecuted and jailed. I knew that some lawyers of the Gambian nationality were not keen to be appointed judges due to the perception that one could get into the crosshairs of government for not doing what the people in power wanted. The Gambia being a smaller country than mine, I found work in that, I found work in the Gambia at that time even more challenging than in Nigeria. Then the time came when I sat on appeal by 3 prominent opposition politicians. I sat with 2 other judge colleagues. The appellants had all been refused bail in the Gambian High Court, where they were charged with sedition. My 2 colleagues on the bench gave a judgment refusing the appeal. I disagreed and allowed the appeal in my minority judgment, and the backlash was instant. The Gambian government immediately withdrew an earlier approval to the Commonwealth to renew my 2-year contract, which was near expiry. I left the Gambia in March 2006, a judge with no job. I must hasten to add that the Commonwealth supported me, as did the Gambia Bar Association, which later honored me for outstanding professionalism and for upholding judicial independence, the best award I ever received. I've recalled some of the difficult times I passed through as a judicial officer in Africa. The judicial officer who only wanted to render justice without fear or favor, and the unfavorable consequences that followed. I have also recounted a more recent experience of dehumanization by armed soldiers as a citizen in Southeast Nigeria. In highlighting these unpleasant situations, I only wish to underscore my conviction that Agenda 2063 is a welcome and much needed framework for the continent. I am certain too that some of us Africans who live in our home countries have had similar or worse experiences in our different spaces due to the unwillingness of some of our governments to subscribe to good governance, democracy, justice, and the rule of law, and the observance of human rights. And I go to my next slide, and I title it Leadership That Lacks Political Will is Antithetical to Agenda 2063. Political office holders have a duty to act for the common good of their peoples, rather than for their own narrow self-interest. It is not a generalization to assert that many African countries had, at some point in their post-colonial past, labored under one form of autocratic leadership or another, even military rule. Only recently, there was a military coup d'etat in Mali. I believe some kind of transition to democratic rule at the urging of the African Union is ongoing there at the moment, and it is hoped that such a transition will be achieved. Although most countries on the continent currently subscribe to a democratic system of government, the quality of democracy varies from one to another. What am I saying? What some African countries have can only be described as nominal democracy. Lack of the political will even now at this time, to devolve power away from the center, to allocate resources where they are needed, or to allow true independence, including financial independence for the judiciary and local government systems, and even for some legislative houses, simply mean that Agenda 2063 is imperiled. In Nigeria, the courts were recently shut down for 2 months due to a nationwide strike by judiciary workers who were agitating for the financial autonomy of the judiciary. The strike ended about a week ago, and we here eagerly wait to see if anything was gained by it. Where the leadership of any African country is populated by a rent-seeking political class, mired in corruption, impunity, lack of accountability, and nepotism, that country's mere subscription to Agenda 2063 will be meaningless and will not ensure the much-needed sustainable development for this continent. Legislators in Nigeria and Kenya are known to earn salaries. I mean, federal legislators in Nigeria at least, and their counterparts in Kenya are known to earn salaries and allowances which they fix for themselves and which, apart from being much higher than the earnings of their counterparts in the developed world, do not relate in any way to the salaries of the ordinary citizens who voted them into power. These fantastic salaries and allowances are collected in addition to other rent-seeking activities. Admittedly, the 7 aspirations which Africa has set for itself in Agenda 2063 appear daunting, mainly because there are certain entrenched political cultures on this continent which must shift in order that this fantastic agenda, Agenda 2063, can be achieved. In other words, transformational leadership is sorely needed in all African countries. In addition to the constitutions and laws of member states and this continent's rich human and material resources, the African Union has enough social and legal frameworks to support Agenda 2063. Achieving all the 7 aspirations set out in the agenda is the legacy that Africa must bequeath its youth, which constitute more than 60% of its population. And then I look at the problem of brain drain in Africa. My next slide. The problem of brain drain in Africa affects the continent's capacity to develop. Africa is richly endowed with human resources, and the absence of good governance and other components of aspirations 3 and 4 have robbed her of the skills and expertise of many of her citizens. Clearly, not every African in the diaspora intended to leave Africa to settle in America or Europe. Many have settled outside the continent because of the lack of access to the tools with which to practice their profession. Some others are economic migrants who did not have adequate job opportunities or the enabling environment to set up and run their businesses in their own countries. And then, of course, there are those who left Africa due to strife, violence, or even persecution. It is a well-known fact that many Africans in the diaspora have made notable social and professional achievements in their respective countries of adoption. For instance, there is Bennett Omalu, who is a Nigerian-American physician, a forensic pathologist and neuropathologist, who was the first to discover and publish findings of chronic trauma encephalopathy in American football players. And there's Nana Eisen Akiwowo, a Ghanaian American who, through her organization, Africa Health Now, has positively impacted the lives of more than 200,000 people by servicing communities in Ghana through transforming local spaces into medical clinics and bringing education and primary health care to those in need. Similarly, there are many other influential Africans in the diaspora, some of whom have been recognized for outstanding achievements. My point here is that the steady brain drain from our continent will likely slow down if we're able to earnestly and actively engage with the implementation of Agenda 2063. Up until the early 1990s, Africans who left to study in Europe and America hurried home at the end of their studies to join in the process of national and continental development. Some of our medical doctors, some of them have studied medicine in Africa, but have migrated abroad to settle in America and European countries, where they have healthy democratic cultures and with properly functioning hospitals, with opportunities for them to find greater fulfillment in their work. The same is the situation for other African professionals. In African universities, intellectualism continues to decline, and there are now even fewer centers of scholarly research due to governmental neglect of the education sector and poor funding. Well, the 21st century arrived with great expectations, and the world, through the United Nations, adopted the Millennium Development Goals in 2000 for the year 2015. The MDG consisted of 8 goals with measurable targets and deadlines. And the end report for the SDGs showed that great successes were made in that the number of people living in extreme poverty declined by more than half. The number of out-of-school children of primary school age reduced by nearly half, while child mortality, new HIV infections, malaria, and tuberculosis fell drastically. It is important that Africa borrows a leaf from the single-mindedness and seriousness in the implementation of the Millennium Development Goals. More needs to be done to achieve the aspirations of Agenda 2063 than merely setting 10-yearly deadlines. I'd like to quickly touch on the matter of education in Africa. The whole business of education is not one of my slides anyway. The whole business of education in Africa needs to be reviewed. It will be necessary to invest more in science and technology and implement a new education curriculum for a new Africa. Perspectives for the teaching of history, the humanities, science and technology must drastically change in order to meet Africa's development needs. And again, I just quickly want to look at the challenge of Africa's nationalities. The AU must purposefully look again at the formation of African nations to see if the natural ethnic lines running deep in African blood, in our blood, will be the basis of a more peaceful Africa. A reconstruction of the colonial nation states should be brought to the table if Africa is serious about addressing conflicts on the continent. And then I go to the next slide, which is publicity for Agenda 2063. The Millennium Development Goals as a global development plan was placed on the front burner from the time of its adoption. 'Look Local and international activities and media publicity around the MDGs could not be missed. By contrast, I became aware of the existence of Africa's Agenda 2063 only a couple of weeks ago when I was invited to give this keynote. At the time of the agenda's adoption in 2013 and 2015, I was living and working in Nairobi, Kenya, but I never heard about it. I never knew about it. And for over 1.5 years, since I've returned and lived in my country, Nigeria, I have not seen any publicity around this important initiative. There exists the palpable danger that African countries who are the owners of this vision and development initiative are paying scant attention to it. Aspiration 6 of Agenda 2063, 6, and I quote, an Africa whose development is people-driven, relying on the potential of African people, especially its women and youth, unquote. It is the responsibility of our governments and the press to ensure that enough publicity is generated around Agenda 2063 within African countries. This is because this development initiative must be owned by Africa's peoples, who must hold leadership accountable for not playing its part. African stakeholders, including the civil society, who were part of the consultations that bettered the agenda, have a duty to bring it close to the people, and in particular to women and youth. Social media has the kind of unparalleled reach, which must be tapped into to bring Agenda 2063 to the doorsteps of ordinary Africans. And I look at the time frame and the agenda, time frame for Agenda 2063, which is my next slide. It must be acknowledged that the road to achieving the aspirations of Agenda 2063 will be long and difficult. This is because this continent faces many challenges, since most African countries still need to improve and deepen democratic cultures and to build enduring democratic institutions. Africa is also the poorest region of the world with underdeveloped infrastructure, while peace and security elude many parts of the continent. The teeming population of the youth can translate to great potential for the future, but only if that potential is carefully nurtured and harnessed, and formal education made more relevant to our needs. I have already pointed out that political will that rests on transformational leadership is needed to make the difference and build an empowered citizenry in order to achieve the sustainable development that this continent needs and desires. The Millennium Development Goals lasted 15 years and made considerable progress in meeting their targets. They have since been replaced by the Sustainable Development Goals. Our Agenda 2063 is a 50-year development plan, which is further structured into 5 10-year implementation phases for all the 7 aspirations listed. Although Africa has serious challenges, I still hold the view that a 50-year development plan such as this will likely make for lethargic implementation. Looking through the first continental reports of February 2020 and the performance of AU member states, it can be discerned that some countries are still at ground zero in respect of certain aspirations and goals of Agenda 2063. A 25-year agenda would have been just right, in my view. It may be necessary to get the AU Commission more involved in the country-to-country implementation of the agenda, Because for implementation to be meaningful in this context, it must be accelerated. It must be accelerated and closely monitored. And on that subject of who's going to publicize, who's going to push this agenda, while scoring through available material on Agenda 2063, I found that a not-for-profit organization known as the Agenda 2063 Academy was founded in July 2019 in the Kingdom of Eswatini, otherwise known as Swaziland. Its stated mission on its website is to be Africa's lead advocate for civil society engagement of Agenda 2063. The Academy seeks to engage African civil society and Africans, both on the continent and in the diaspora, to be the main drivers and stakeholders of the implementation of the agenda. The organization aims to increase awareness of Agenda 2063 and to improve access to opportunities for Africa's women and youth to become active change agents in their local communities. Such an initiative must be commended, and more civil society organizations in Africa will do well to also take on this important agenda, Agenda 2063. And now I go to reimagining Agenda 2063, my next slide. My message today is that reimagining and re-examining Agenda 2063 reveals that, one, the agenda is a holistic plan for Africa's sustainable development and for situating the continent as an equal partner on the global table, and ought to be supported by us all. Two, Africa's peoples, especially the youth and women, must be brought into the picture through proper domestication and adequate publication of the agenda by member states, in order that they too can own and drive the process. Three, political will that is based on transformational leadership will bring about a significant and positive shift in Africa's ability to deliver the dividends of Agenda 2063. And finally, four, the time frame of 50 years, in my view, again, makes for lethargic and unserious implementation and ought to be revisited and revised. Those are my submissions and those are my messages for today. And in conclusion, I'd like to say that as citizens of Africa, we will begin to feel the impact of Agenda 2063 when the opportunities are created for our youth to find gainful employment and to embrace entrepreneurship. The impact will also be felt when the best in our continent is enabled to reach their full potential in Africa rather than outside of it. And when our human rights are respected by government agents, thus bringing democracy, justice, and peace within our reach. And my final take on this is that Africa must get this right. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Judge Izuako, for your thought, such a thought-provoking speech. Your personal story is reflective of the many struggles experienced across the continent. And so thank you for kicking off our conference by sharing your vision of Agenda 2063 in the way that you did. So I noticed that there were some comments and questions that came through the chat while you were speaking. I did want to point out that the Institute for African Women in Law directed everyone to a forthcoming video of you in the African Women in Law Legacy Project, which viewers can view on YouTube. So thank you for sharing that. I think that came from Dr. Dewuni. So thank you for sharing that with everyone. Sorry.
Thank you so much for your patience. I appreciate it. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to get someone on the line to have a further look at this. It appears our phone lines are a little busy. I apologize for that. So if it's okay, I'll put you on a further 3 to 5 minute hold while I get back on the queue.
Okay, I think that it was somebody who accidentally unmuted themselves, but we're not sharing comments for us. Apologies for that. We also have a first question for you, Judge Izuako, from Atieno Samandari. He asked, hearing your experience with life-threatening corruption in at least 2 countries, and we have heard reports of such being common in many African countries, sadly, the crisis of African leadership, despite constitutional changes, etc., is in the final analysis a moral crisis. How can we begin to address this moral crisis as Africans? And while Judge Izuako considers that question, I would encourage others to either raise their hands if they want to pose questions directly to Judge Izuako, or to post questions in the chat, either to everyone or to me directly if you wish to remain anonymous. So over to you, Judge Izuako. How can we begin to address this moral crisis as Africans?
Yeah. Yes, indeed, we have a moral crisis in Africa. And this is my honest view. At least from my experiences, perhaps there are African countries where, people fare better. How to address this moral crisis? I think the youth, women, everybody needs to be on board. And we need to look again at how we elect our leaders. I know that everywhere, politics usually is a game in which a lot of money, a lot of funding is involved. But I think that we can address this moral crisis by continuing to educate our youth and by encouraging our youth and women to try and to make an effort at participation. Of course, there's a lot of exclusion in Africa of certain groups. There's a lot of exclusion of young people and the youth, but we need to find ways. And I think it just means that many more people in Africa, many more people who feel, shall I say, unhappy or affronted at the level of moral crisis we have, need to perhaps come out to run for office and bring about a change. I don't know what more I can add to that, but we need to, every hand needs to be on, everyone needs to come on board and not just walk away, maybe in anger and frustration. We all need to come back, pick up our voters' cards or whatever it is, and find avenues for expressing our minds and for calling for the change that we need for this continent to go anywhere in 2063 or after, or even in the 22nd century. This moral crisis needs to be addressed. I agree. I don't know if that satisfies you. Thank you.
I mean, if there are any follow-up questions to that, I'm sure it could be posed to you. The next question that's coming through in the chat is there's coming from the Institute for African Women in Law. There's a lot of discussion about how women should be in leadership positions. But across many countries in Africa, the Maputo Protocol notwithstanding, women are still not well represented in leadership. How can we involve women in leadership is the first part of that question. And the second part is what practical steps can be taken from the community to the national level to involve more women in leadership positions?
How to involve women in political participation. I think we, the women of Africa, have right from the days of Beijing and so on, have continued to call for affirmative action. Because to tell the truth, women don't have a head start. And that's just what it is. Women do not have a head start, not only in Africa, even in other continents, but of course we're concerned about our continent here. And for women to be able to even have proper representation, there has to be affirmative action. And affirmative action has to be part of the Constitution, as I believe it is in Kenya. Because I believe that Kenya's latest constitution, the current one they use now, there is something about either 30% or 33% representation for women. We do not have that kind of provision in our own constitution in Nigeria. That would be a starting point, at least. That would be a starting point. So talking about involving women so that they can make a difference. I think even while the African Union, or rather when the African Union heads of state and whatever meet, there are other issues they can talk about. The issue of women's participation, the issues of affirmative action. These are some of the issues, because we cannot glibly claim to subscribe to Agenda 2063. And one of the aspirations talks about involving or including women and youth. And we just say that and we walk away. A lot has been said about the non-involvement of women and young people in the in the political affairs of my own country, Nigeria. I think there was a second question, Sarah.
Yeah, the second part of that question asked, what are the practical steps that can be taken from the community to the national level? So you spoke of affirmative action being constitutionalized. Are there any other practical steps that you recommend?
taking actions that can, be taken to bring in women at the community level. Yes, if we put affirmative action in the Constitution, it will not only be at the national levels, it will be at the state levels also, and at the local government levels. And I believe civil society too, and government should actively pursue the matter of women participation. Civil society, I know in Nigeria, has been doing a lot to enhance the position of women. Civil society in Nigeria has, the issue of marginalization of women has been one of the biggest issues for the civil society in this country. And I think it needs to continue. And I know that women's groups and other civil society groups continue to push for better representation of women. I think African leaders, when they go to Addis Ababa or wherever they go to, and put all these agendas forward and talk about aspirations and visions and dreams for Africa, they cannot simply glibly talk about, women's participation and walk away. There have to be practical steps. And I keep harping on affirmative action. Thank you.
Thanks for that response, Judge Izuako. The next question from Amelia asks, she says, first, many thanks for an excellent keynote, and asks, can you share with us your motivation for standing up against corruption? What sustained you at those dark times? Where did you get the strength and courage to stand for your beliefs?
Thank you. Everyone has a family, everyone has a background. Every one of us, we all belong to families. We all went to, well, people like some of us went through education, and we know what we were told in school. I mean, the people who taught us, and especially when you aspire to be a lawyer. I mean, there was so much about the kind of lawyer you ought to be. There was so much about the kind, hello? Yeah, there was a lot about what makes a lawyer, what kind of a lawyer are you supposed to be? And then of course, you rise in the profession and you come to a point when your community or the country reposes enough trust in you and you are appointed to a public office and you take an oath of office. I think I derive my motivation from believing in justice, from my background, from my youth, as a student activist a student parliamentarian in the university, up to my legal studies, up to my work in the judiciary. I simply believe that as a judge, as someone who is privileged to sit in judgment over other people, I needed to stand up for some things. And of course, every profession has its hazards. And you know, more senior colleagues used to say things like, oh, you know, there are hazards of the profession too. But you never know until it begins to happen to you, until you start, you know, you are faced with experiences such as the ones I was faced with. And I knew that for me, it was either standing up for what was just and what was right or nothing. And I think at the end of the day, I believe my children learned something. My friends, people around me, my family, everybody was proud. And I am proud too, that I'm able to stand up for what I know to be wrong. I'm able to stand up against what I know to be wrong. So talking about motivation, it's a whole lot in one's background, actually. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, Judge Izuako. I think it's remarkable to hear about your courage and how that carried you through your career as a judge. And I mean, I think hearing it is one thing, but I mean, having to experience everything you experienced is something else. So thank you for your courage. The next question comes from Dr. Chichi Nemezi, who starts off by saying, thank you for sharing your experience, speaking up and standing for your rights. I'm proud of you, of Sharon Girl. Okay, so I guess this is somebody who you might know and who actually does not have a question.
Yeah, that's my classmate.
Yeah, who's just actually saying thank you.
Yeah.
So next, the other question that came to me in the chat was, the individual says they heard you say that we need to rethink the colonial borders in order to address ongoing conflicts on the continent. They wanted clarification and ask, were you alluding to the need for greater African unity? And if so, how do we ensure that greater integration does not lead to new conflicts?
Yes, thank you. Yes, African unity, of course, I believe in. But we cannot deny the fact that within Africa, and if you look at many places in Africa where there have been one form of conflict or the other, Africa has many nationalities. And some of these, some countries in Africa, of course, we know what happened in Berlin when Africa was partitioned. The colonialists merely partitioned Africa according to their own convenience. And people found themselves in all kinds of play, simply put together here and there and so on. Now, some of the conflicts in Africa have been based on, I hate to say ethnic, the matter of nationalities. I think, and some of these conflicts have persisted. I think at the heads of state who attend these meetings of the African Union, it will not harm them to look at the matter of strifes and conflicts on the continent. I mean, we saw what happened in Sudan and South Sudan, and finally, where it ended. Of course, we know there's still some kind of strife, or there was still some disagreement and strife, both in Sudan and South Sudan, after they had gone their separate ways. But I'm just putting it out there that this might be a matter that the AU will do well to look at and see what can be done. Honestly, see what can be done. And that does not detract in any way from African unity. I believe in African unity. I lived in the Gambia, I lived in Kenya, and I actually, when I was recruited by the United Nations, I had to choose. I was made to choose, where do you want to go to? We had 3 locations: Geneva, New York, Nairobi. I decided to go to Nairobi. I told them I wanted to go to Nairobi because that is Africa. So my point here is African unity does not detract from, or rather, looking at the matter of different nationalities in Africa and the agitations and strifes and conflicts that have arisen sometimes will not detract from African unity. It is just a suggestion out there so that when we talk about peace and when we talk about security and we talk about conflict in Africa, these are some of the matters we should be looking at, so that an honest examination of these matters of nationalities will perhaps lead to better, or lead to the peace that we all create on this continent. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, for your answer, Judge Izuako. I think you're encouraging African leaders to move past those type of identities that can, keep them from addressing some of the critical issues that are afflicting the continent. So I think perhaps, not to speak for you, but I think maybe that is what your statements were really going towards, that we have to think bigger and beyond, just borders and nationality.
Yeah.
So the next question comes from Brenda Combo, and they start off by saying, thank you very much, Judge Izuako. I was interested in the important points you made about education in Africa. Could you share your thoughts on how legal education in particular needs to be transformed so lawyers better serve the continent?
Legal education in Africa. Yes, well, if you ask me about legal education in Africa, I believe that a lot more, when you talk about legal education, I believe that African students who study law need to, because, how will I put this now? They need to actually it needs to be it needs to be emphasized, rather, it needs to be emphasized that a lawyer is somebody who thinks. We know that a lawyer goes to the courtroom, deals with an issue, deals with a case, and so on and so forth. But those of us who are lawyers know that law is a lot more than just going to the courtroom to win your case. So I think legal education also needs to, a lot of ethics, a lot more of the subject of ethics needs to be part of our legal education, so that our law students will understand better that the law is not all about bread and butter. It is a lot more than that. There's a lot of responsibility on the shoulders of those who are lawyers. When you're dealing in society, when you're within the society, there's a lot of responsibility for those who are lawyers. And lawyers, our law students must learn that they must be ethical at all times, and that ethics is very, very important. And I think more needs to be done in the area of ethical education for our law students. This is what I can say about legal education in Africa, because I believe that if law students learn to be more ethical, or learn that the matter of ethics is practically the cornerstones. I mean, when you're talking ethics, you're talking credibility and things like that. This is the cornerstone. This is more what makes you a lawyer, in the sense that you must stand for, even when, of course, we're taught in school that even when you stand, if you're a prosecutor, for instance, you have to put your case up front on the table. You have to put your cards on the table, because it is not about securing a conviction at every stage. You need to put your cards face up on the table. And everywhere you find yourself, you need to be ethical. Even if being ethical appears to be in the way of losing your case. So this is what I have to say about legal education in Africa. There is need to infuse more of ethics and ethical behavior. And with it, of course, comes credibility and so on. So this is what I have to say about legal education in Africa. I think we need more of the infusion of ethics in legal education. Because the problem is not that our law students are not reading tort and contract and criminal law and not passing. Of course, they are passing the exams. But what is even more important is that the person who stands there to be admitted to practice law is an ethical person, more ethical than the next citizen. Thank you.
The next question comes from Ife Okoye, and they ask a question that has you look back to colonialism and also current forms of legal economic colonialism. So they ask, how do we successfully achieve the aspirations of Agenda 2063, given the fact that while Africa is still dislodging the chokehold of past colonialism, much of the continent is headed to a second and worst form of legal economic colonialism. Our current leaders are borrowing and selling the best of Africa to China, thereby mortgaging the future of women and children, which Agenda 2063 aspires to protect. Thank you. And they also add thank you for your keynote address.
Thank you. Yes, a lot of concern has been raised about Africa's the new found friendships or economic relationships between African countries and China. A lot has been said and written. And I know, for instance, that Nigeria has borrowed a lot from China in the matter of building railways and so on. And I also know that from what I read in the papers, other countries, Eastern Africa, Western Africa, and so on, seem to be borrowing heavily from China. I think at the end of the day, whether we borrow from China or we borrow from the World Bank or we borrow from other partners in Europe and America, I think the bottom line is that African leaders need to be more transparent. They need to show more honesty. I mean, we know that this continent has, the backwardness of this continent up till now, a lot of this has been brought about by corruption. Corruption, because we know that some people in position, political positions in Africa would go borrowing from other countries and other places. And at the end of the day, with the ostensibly to improve or to build infrastructure. And at the end of the day, we find that there's no infrastructure, or if there's something, they're white elephant projects. Sometimes they are not finished, and so on and so forth. Yes, that is a problem. But my take on this, I also think that Africa needs to be careful about going and borrowing. But of course, we know that Africa is the poorest continent in the world, and we cannot do without borrowing. But can borrowing be responsible and transparent? I think this is what it needs to be. Thank you very much.
The next question is from Dr. Ngozi Chuma Ume, who's also from Nigeria. And they state that they can relate to the story about the militarization of the southeastern part of the country. It says it is indeed a terrible situation. What they would like to know is if there's any possibility of adopting a nuanced approach with respect to affirmative action. They consider that affirmative action lacks meritocracy and demeans true achievement. So they're wondering if you instead have maybe a nuanced approach to affirmative action?
Affirmative action, I'm sorry, I didn't get the whole of that. Affirmative action in respect of women?
I assume so, because we spoke about it in that context.
Okay. And the question is that affirmative action is demeaning or something?
They find it so, yeah. They consider affirmative action lacks meritocracy and demeans true achievement. So do you perhaps have a nuanced take on affirmative action, yeah, or not? Yeah.
Yes, apart from encouraging Africa to train its women and I think at this point, because we won't be talking about affirmative action if the women folk were not so far behind. Because sometimes, or at this time, when you look at the way Africa has evolved and the way the world has evolved, not just Africa, Asia, other continents, women were traditionally neglected, put on the back burner, regarded as mini persons. And now we want to talk about bringing women into, seeing that women are included in decisions and in the process of developing Africa. I think, well, affirmative action is not something that continues forever. Affirmative action is something that as we know, will normally be for a period of time. And we know that it is simply to give the less privileged people a head start. And so when I talk about affirmative action, I am not saying let us jettison meritocracy, no. But how do you even talk about meritocracy when you look, for instance, at the way political positions are fought for and the way they are obtained in this continent? Most women don't have the kind of money that, to run even a proper political campaign in Africa, because we know that in Africa, a lot of money is involved. Most women may not even have the, Africans still need to be made to see that women can be equal partners, that women can perform. Not everybody sees it that way. And this is why I think affirmative action, which is only for a period of time, I don't say it as demeaning. I think it is just right. In order to give women a head start, it cannot be forever. It is just for a period of time. If we say, we put it in the Constitution, that there will be affirmative action for women to get into political positions, 30% representation for a period of 30 years or 50 years. I think it will be just right. And in that time, there would have been, there will be some kind of building up. It will be easier to take it from there. So I do not think, and of course, when we talk about affirmative action, it doesn't mean throw a meritocracy in the bin, because of course there are women who are capable in Africa. There are women who can do the things that men can do. The only thing is they're not given the opportunity. And affirmative action in this case is saying, give these women an opportunity. It doesn't mean that if there is a professional requirement or an educational requirement for that position, it should be jettisoned. No. It simply means give these women a head start. And of course, we're talking about the women who fit the bill, the right women for the position. Thank you.
So we have two last questions for you in the chat, Judge Izuako. The first comes from Rita. And they start off by thanking you for your very wonderful presentation and setting the stage for this conference. And she wonders if you can provide more thoughts on how Africa must get this right, meaning this Agenda 2063, but goes on to say, I think a major challenge is changing attitudes of Africans as a whole. It seems that the nature of who we are has changed so much that it has distorted our ability to see what should be important for us as Africans. For example, they suggest that we should consider the fight that broke out last week at the Pan-African Parliament in Johannesburg, South Africa. So how do we address the challenge of needing to change attitudes of Africans?
Thank you. I think when we talk about education on the continent, or better education for everyone, and when we begin to address the matter of the kind of people in the political spaces in Africa, Because when I talk about things like this, I'm looking at my own country. First of all, if you look at political representation, all the people, not all the people, of course, most of the people who vie for one political position or the other, perhaps will not have been considered qualified if they didn't have the money to throw around, or if they didn't do things like rig elections and so on. So when I say that Africa needs to get this right, part of what I'm saying is, I said it in when I was giving my speech, that we need transformational leadership. Leadership that is transformational. And we need also, although we talk a lot about, there were times when many African countries were being ruled by people who had engaged in one coup d'etat or the other and came in as soldiers and ruled by decrees and pushed everyone around and jettisoned democracy and good governance and abused human rights to no end. There were times like that. And then it began to evolve. The world wouldn't have any of this. And Africa itself, at least the African Union, started preaching against this kind of governance. I think, and now it looks like there is less of this coup d'etats, never mind what happened in Mali recently in Africa. When I say that Africa must get this right, I'm talking about transformational leadership. We who are Africans, there's a lot of poverty on this continent. And when there's poverty, it also militates against the people and against, to a large extent, informs the kind of people they put in power. And so I talk about transformational leadership. And I mean that the people who ought to know, scholars and African professionals and people of like minds in Africa must begin to engage properly and begin to query even religious leaders in Africa, because there's so much religion in Africa, and still things are not getting better. All these leaders in various sectors in this continent need to speak out, need to come out and give support for the kind of change we need in Africa. Because if we don't have transformational leadership, the kind of leadership that thinks, the kind of leadership that brings in people who know what to do, people who can think, people who can bring up ideas. If we do not have that kind of, those kinds of leaders, 2063 will not happen, or this agenda is going nowhere. So when I talk about getting it right, I mean the civil society, the media, never mind that sometimes media is even clamped down in Africa, the media, women, the young, and everybody else, scholars, everybody needs to come on board and give this push so that Africa can get this right. Because if we don't have the kind of leaders that can take us to 2063, they are going to reformulate this agenda, and in 2063, when even my grandchildren will be, some of my grandchildren will be in their 60s and 70s, they're going to keep on doing this agenda and transforming it and adding it on. And you find that even in the 22nd century, this continent hasn't gone anywhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Izuako. And we have the final question that we'll ask from Samuel. I'll ask his first question. He had posed the second one, but we'll just wrap up the keynote address with this question that he's asked. It begins by, of course, thanking you for your thought-provoking presentation. And he asks, many African countries have their national specific goals or visions. For instance, there was the Vision 2020 in Nigeria. In many instances, these national goals are only colorful on paper, but has little or no impact on national life and economy. How can we be confident that Agenda 2063 will go far in affecting the long-needed transformational change in Africa?
Thank you. Thank you. I think this is exactly, where I was getting, what I was trying to say when I said Africa needs to get this right this time around. If we're going to get to 2063 and see any change, and I believe that we can, before 2060, long before 2063, we can have the kind of Africa we want to a large extent, if only we will do what we need to do. Yes, talking about national goals that are colorful on paper and so on and so forth, this is true. It is because of the kind of leadership we have. And perhaps, again, the kind of followership. But we know that repressive governments and repressive leaders do not give room for their people to even ask for accountability, to ask for transparency. A lot is said about fighting corruption, and you find that corruption continues to multiply. In fact, I shudder to think where we will be in 10 years when we talk about corruption, for instance, because it's gotten to the point that even the ordinary African, or the ordinary, let me say Nigerian at least, who is in the civil service or whatever, doesn't even have a living wage. Everyone is trying to find, there's what they call hustling. Everyone is trying to find something else to do. People even sit in their offices and in the corner, they are selling water and soda and all kinds of things. Everybody is doing something. Even the gate man will be asking you for money before you can come in and see the big man. So that, yes, a lot of talk about national goals, a lot of nice things on paper. But even Agenda 2063, I haven't even heard about it. I haven't seen it on paper. I haven't seen it anywhere. I have had to go out and searching, looking for where is this agenda? And I'm going to continue to ask the questions in my own country. I want to know who is taking charge of this, what is happening, because I haven't even had it on radio or television. And we know that this is the problem Africa has, because we have, I've said it, insincere leaders who are more interested in their own selfish ends than in the good of the population that has elected them. I think what I can say is that all hands need to be on deck. And in every little corner in which you find yourself as an African, whether you're on the continent or in diaspora, please, can everybody do something, no matter how small, to make this place a better place? Because I think if all of us in our different professions, in our different little corners, try to do the right thing, even in spite of the constraints we face. If we try to do the right thing, I think we'll make some kind of difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Izuako. That's quite a thought to leave us all with at the end of your remarks. So that brings us to the end of our keynote address. I want to thank Judge Izuako again for joining us and for starting a conversation to kickstart the conference that speaks to many of the challenges of realizing Agenda 2063. Thanks to everyone who has joined us for the start of our conference. If you would like to revisit this conversation, just a reminder that the recording will be made available online after the conference ends. So we'll be taking a break now, but please make sure to join us for our first session, Innovating Development, which starts at 12 p.m. Vancouver time, so just under 90 minutes from now, using the same Zoom link. I hope to see many of you then. Take care. Thanks again for joining us.